Well, I'm really glad to have you with us for tonight's lecture. My name is Paul Quigley, and I'm here in the history department at Virginia Tech, where I teach history and also run the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies. And it's the center that's sponsoring tonight's lecture. And many of you will know, regular attendees, we host these kinds of events throughout the academic year. We've had a really good run this year, despite the pandemic. We've enjoyed reaching new audiences through Zoom and offering a really great series of lectures. Our other activities include organizing academic conferences. We give out grants and scholarships to students at Virginia Tech and researchers to come and visit and use the special collections at Virginia Tech. We also do outreach projects, local museums, local elementary schools, that kind of thing, and lots more besides. So I encourage you to check out our website, civilwar.vt.edu, nice and easy to remember. And you can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube. And this is the last event for the academic year. It's the last in a series of lectures we've been hosting this year called the New Perspectives on the Civil War Era Speaker Series. It's been a wonderful series. I've really enjoyed hearing these emerging voices in Civil War history and kind of getting a sense for what the future of the field is going to be over the next years and decades. And the series has been organized by me, in conjunction with our postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Caroline Newhall, who's with us this evening, and you'll hear from her later during the Q&A session. She and I are going to jointly moderate the questions and steer them towards our speaker. So it's the last one for the academic year. We tend not to be so active during the academic summer months, but even though you won't see any new lectures for a few months, you can always check out any of the previous ones from this year. Again, on the YouTube channel, just search for Virginia Center for Civil War Studies, or several of them are already available on the C-SPAN website as well. So on to tonight's speaker, Dr. Holly Pinheiro. He's an assistant professor of history right now at Augusta University, but in the fall, he's going to be taking up a new position at Furman University in South Carolina. So congratulations on the new job and best of luck there. While at Augusta University, one of the big projects he's worked on is to establish a race and social justice project, which included creating an endowed scholarship for students studying Black history. He's the author of several articles on Black Civil War military service. And right now he's in the final stages of finishing off a book, which is going to be published by the University of Georgia Press next year. So definitely one to look out for. It's called The Family's War, same title as tonight's lecture. So we're going to get a sneak preview of the book tonight. And he's going to speak for about 30 to 35 minutes. So we'll have plenty of time for questions. And the way you can ask questions is through the Q&A box in Zoom. So at any time, you can start now if you already have a question, or anytime through the lecture or at the end, type your questions into the Q&A box, and we will keep an eye on the questions as they come in. Dr. Newhall and I will steer them towards Dr. Pinheiro, and I'm looking forward to seeing the questions you ask and the discussion it generates. We've had excellent discussions after all of our lectures this year, and I'm sure tonight is going to be no exception. So with your questions, we'll after the lecture, we will have a significant discussion, and we'll wrap things up by about 8:15 Eastern time, so about an hour and 10 minutes from now. So that's all from me. Thanks again for joining us, and special thanks and a very warm welcome to the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies, at least in this virtual space, to Dr. Holly Pinheiro. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to thank Virginia Tech University, the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies, Caroline Newhall, and Dr. Paul Quigley for providing me with the opportunity to speak about my research for my forthcoming book, The Family Civil War, which will be out with the University of Georgia Press next year in the Uncivil War series. And I'll just also note, as a proud Virginian, it's always nice to talk with people from my home state, and it would have been wonderful to be there, and hopefully in a post-pandemic world that is possible. And I definitely look forward to the audience's questions and conversations. If it just helps in terms of what I'm going to talk about today, in many ways, this is elements, but not all, of my manuscript's introduction to give you the idea, along with a case study of the one of the many family members that I can talk about. All right. Go ahead and start my timer. Sorry, I'm getting my timer ready. So again, the book title is The Family Civil War, the subtitle being Northern African American Soldiers and Their Fight for Racial Justice, and coming out with the University of Georgia Press. Now, it is well known, thanks to a growing body of scholarship, that the enlistment campaign for Northern African American men in cities such as Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that war propagandists, including some of the individuals seen here, that being Frederick Douglass, Anna Dickinson, and Henry Highland Garnet, emphasized the supposed responsibilities that able-bodied African American men had to emancipate their enslaved Southern brethren. Enlistment rhetoric claimed that demonstrating one's patriotic manhood would allow them to acquire full citizenship rights, including voting rights, possibly. War propagandists collectively argued that the racial discrimination that all United States colored troops, or USCT as I'll note from this point forward, soldiers would experience some form of racial discrimination in service, unfortunately. Even so, potential USCT recruits were told to focus on ending slavery while simultaneously proving that African American manhood paralleled their white counterparts. In doing so, it could lead to them attaining post-war rights, such as suffrage rights or the protection of their civil rights, and refuting negative racial stereotypes, all through military service. Unfortunately, for many Northern African American families, wartime mobilization ignored the dire economic situations that they experienced in American society. The removal of able-bodied African American men hindered an ongoing economic crisis for working poor African American Philadelphian families who were already suffering due to racial discrimination that impacted their lives on a daily basis. In some cases, their financial woes continued generations after the Civil War ended. Now, military service did not exist in isolated segments of a soldier's life. Although different from soldiers on the front lines, the families of USCT soldiers also dealt with the consequences of military participation, as the effects had the ability to reverberate to the home front in ways that very few had anticipated. The notion that serving in USCT regiments would demonstrate the plausibility for creating a racially egalitarian society could only occur if African American men sacrificed their lives for a nation that legalized slavery and the oppression of free African Americans, and ignored the fact that these men would have to, in many cases, die to achieve it. Nor was there any recognition of how it could impact the recruits' families. At the same time, surviving the war did not necessarily improve the social or economic standing for many USCT enlisted men or their families. Now, I believe Philadelphia is an ideal location to examine free Northern African Americans who navigated a city with extreme partisan and racial politics, where racial violence, including large-scale race riots, were unfortunately commonplace throughout the 19th century. Still, it had the most significant free Northern African American population in 1860, with over 22,000, which was 4% of the city's population at that time. Philadelphia also had prominent abolitionist networks that included nationally recognized activists, including Lucretia Mott and Octavius Cotto, which make it an ideal location to investigate. Now, Pennsylvania would raise 3 USCT regiments, the 3rd United States Colored Infantry, or USCI, the 6th USCI, and the 8th USCI, which all trained in Philadelphia, where the majority of the recruiting took place. In essence, Civil War military service was inescapable for African American Philadelphians by 1863 as the militarization of the city and its populace pressed onward to support the war effort in a multitude of ways. However, many people advocating for African American men to enlist in the US Army seem to either ignore or downplay the harsh reality of life that all local African Americans, due to racial discrimination in every facet of society, live through on a daily basis as they battled for their survival, literally and economically. Now, in total, 185 native Philadelphian men would serve in one of these three Pennsylvania USCT regiments. To be clear, this number does not even comprise 1% of the city's total African American population. And since each regiment usually capped at 1,000 enlisted men, the soldiers that I investigate encompass over 6% of a collective regiment's population. Now, regardless of their small proportion, every one of their lives mattered. However, these men were never merely cannon fodder, military laborers, or emancipators. These men were fathers, brothers, sons, cousins, and friends to a marginalized segment of Philadelphians residing in households where individuals, including young children, had to contribute to their family's finances to stave off poverty, if only temporarily. Now, from 1850 well into the 1930s, the nearly 1,000 individuals in multi-generational families that I study dealt with the long-term financial ramifications of Civil War military service. Primarily due to the continuance of occupational racial discrimination, racism that the men dealt with in service, and racially discriminatory practices throughout the Civil War pension application process for both invalids and their dependents, collectively jeopardized the finances of many working poor African American Philadelphian families. These effects were felt far beyond any degree that the federal government or war propagandists and even some USCT soldiers could comprehend once the call to arms had occurred. And I'd like to talk about some of the research questions that my book goes into. Now, ultimately, my monograph, The Family Civil War, is guided by three essential inquiries. The first, and arguably most important question I am investigating, is how the enlistment of native-born African-American Philadelphian men into the US Army immediately created, and in some cases enduring, financial hardships that impacted the individuals of multi-generational families who were left behind. Second, how did the continuance of societal racism by federal government agents and various members of Northern society contribute to the household finances of working poor USCT veterans and their families in the late 19th and early 20th century? And finally, who were these soldiers beyond their service? Now, one thing I think it's really important to do is contextualize my study in the conversation of those who've come before me. Now, historians tend to focus on isolated moments of USCT soldiers' experiences, either wartime or the post-war, to illustrate the various hardships that they and their blood-related kin experienced. Wartime studies illuminate how racial discrimination in service made the military experience for African-American men dramatically different from all other soldiers. Joseph Glatar and Keith P. Wilson detail how white officers readily meted out physical punishments on USCT soldiers who, because of their supposed racial inferiority and untrustworthiness, were thought to have deserved cruel punishments. Margaret Humphreys argues that due to racially discriminatory policies based on pseudo-racial science, USCT soldiers primarily performed fatigue duty in harsh climates, which led to more deaths from illness and disease than from Confederate weaponry. Veteranhood scholars stress that white pension agents discriminated against and routinely denied African American Civil War pension applicants primarily on the conviction that they lied. To date, James G. Mendez is the only scholar to place Northern USCT soldiers' families at the center of a monograph study. Though his work focuses on the investigation of letters of African-American women being mothers, wives, sisters, and some family friends. And it is a great book. So if you haven't read it, I strongly encourage you to. Having said that, the Family Civil War seeks to not only provide a holistic analysis of the lives of USCT soldiers and their families, but also recognizes that the Civil War was part of a lifelong racial conflict. The Civil War provided by 1863 African American Philadelphians with the ability to expand the theater of war into the South to defeat Confederates and end slavery as armed combatants. However, the war at home waged by white Northerners never ended. Serving in USCT regiments was not the first time Philadelphian-born USCT soldiers engaged in battles. Every day of their lives, along with other African Americans, was a struggle in which the battle lines were continuously redrawn to benefit white aggressors. African Americans mobilized vigilance committees, trained children on how to navigate and hopefully survive in a violent city, and tried to create safe spaces to protect each other from the onslaught of oppression, but understood that they were never truly safe. Now, even with the wealth of USCT scholarship, one might forget that it was not until the 1950s when modern scholars recognized the historical significance of USCT soldiers. Benjamin Quarles, Frederick M. Bender, Dudley Taylor Cornish published studies that provided overviews of USCT events. In 1965, James McPherson followed suit with an examination of the process of wartime mobilization and immediate post-war issues ongoing during the Reconstruction era, including discussing suffrage rights for African American men. Collectively, these studies sought to re-illuminate a forgotten past. Quote, "The history of the Negro soldier in the Union Army has remained an obscure chapter in American history," end quote, Cornish wrote. For white non-academics and scholars, this statement was perhaps correct, but some African Americans knew otherwise. White scholarly amnesia on studies of USCT soldiers actively ignored the fact that many African American scholars had published work, in some cases 2 years after the Civil War ended, and continued to produce scholarship well into the early 20th century. One African American civilian, William Wells Brown, composed his monograph, "The Negro and the American Rebellion, His Heroism and Fidelity," in 1867, after noticing that white historians either downplayed or ignored the historical significance of USCT regiments. Quote, "I waited patiently before beginning this work, with the hope that someone more competent would take up the subject at hand, but up to the present," Brown lamented, "it has not been done. Although many books have been written upon the rebellion," end quote. There's also the literature of William J. Simmons, George Washington Williams, Joseph T. Wilson, Alexander Heritage Newton, and Isaac J. Hill, who all investigated USCT soldiers' wartime sacrifices. Meanwhile, some USCT veterans made it their mission to inform civilians, including Carter G. Woodson, about their wartime exploits. Additionally, Susie King Taylor, a formerly enslaved woman, published her experiences as a laundress and a nurse for the 33rd USCI and also highlighted the post-war struggles that her family experienced. Thus, African Americans and their families had fought for decades for inclusion in historical memory of the Civil War, but this did not materialize until the modern civil rights movement got underway. Now, a number of the historians previously mentioned served in Northern African American regiments. Afterwards, all of these veterans became historians to confront whites, scholars, and non-academics, and some African Americans who ignored the historical significance of USCT soldiers. Simmons, for instance, lamented in 1887 the fact that his students, most likely at Simmons College in Kentucky, knew little about soldiering for USCT men. Quote, "I have noticed in my long experience as a teacher that some of my students are woefully ignorant of the work of our great colored men, even ignorant of their names," end quote, Simmons states. Ultimately, the Family Civil War builds upon the efforts that began over 130 years ago to uncover the personal histories of USCT soldiers and their extended families in a manner that will bring their names and their experiences to the forefront. Now, at least Simmons in his monograph's dedication, he used to honor the prominent role that African American women had in shaping the lives of all African Americans when he wrote, quote, "The volume is respectfully dedicated to the women of our race," he wrote, "and especially to the devoted, self-sacrificing mothers who molded the lives of the subjects of the sketches, laboring and praying for their success," end quote. Simmons understood the invaluable contributions that African American families, especially women, made in the lives of USCT soldiers. But rather than limit the discussion of the kin to a small portion of the book, like the dedication, USCT soldiers' families must be at the center of a historical analysis. Doing so reveals how Northern African American families continuously fought against racially discriminatory barriers that whites, and even those that they fought alongside with as allies during the war, imposed upon them. Now, the Civil War was neither just a conflict between two armies, nor was it solely about political disputes that spanned regions or even races. It was a war that provided African Americans with the ability to demand equality in American society, but doing so had the capacity to create lasting problems for their families in long and unfortunate ways. Now, to be clear, the family Civil War is more than a Civil War history. It also contributes to the scholarship of Northern African American in urban cities. Studying the lived experiences of Philadelphian-born USCT veterans and their kin over multiple generations allows for new avenues of scholarly analysis. Moreover, this approach will allow readers to recognize how these important but understudied historical figures fought and persevered against racism in Philadelphia. Thus, it is time to acknowledge that the lives of the soldiers and their families did not stop and start with one specific historical moment. Rather, they existed over an expansive period of time that transcended over our conventional periods of historical inquiry. Now, for African American Philadelphian families, establishing and maintaining economic stability for their entire household was difficult and in some cases nearly impossible. Their marginal economic situations forced wives and children in many African American families to work for money. Sometimes these African American families extended beyond kin by blood or marriage and created bonds with fictive kin, an interdisciplinary term that I use to move beyond the limits of the word border, which possibly misrepresents those relations to a market economy definition that ignores the possible emotional connection that these individuals may have had for each other. For example, Nathaniel Logan, a future 60 USCI soldier, resided with 96-year-old Sarah Black, while John W. Jackson of the same regiment lived with 80-year-old Diana Maxfield in 1860. These senior women were unable to work full-time, but residing with these people might have occurred for these families who sought to provide shelter or even possible emotional and medical support for the women. Now, African American families also broadened their familial structure to embrace children in need of supportive people. Even if documented sources never explicitly declared that fictive kin were family, the fact that African Americans opened their homes to non-blood related individuals regularly says otherwise. The willingness to take in these individuals shows that African American families were genuinely concerned with assisting others in fighting racial discrimination and creating stability, hopefully, in the lives of fictive kin. Rather than framing African American families as static and callously seeking to establish this quid pro quo relationship, which the term border can use. Now, in terms of the methodology for this book, rather than conduct a random sample, I am examining Philadelphian-born African American men who served in either the 3rd, 6th, or the 8th USCI, which, as previously stated, is 185 soldiers. By including their families, and that includes fictive kin, it totals to nearly 1,000 people. I am not claiming that this specific group of people is representative for the African American experience, and I want to be clear on that. Now, unlike other African American Philadelphians, this group of individuals had a unique relationship with the federal government and the United States Army, as Civil War service potentially gave them access to federally sponsored social welfare and a way to have their lives, including their hardships, documented in governmental records. Ultimately, USCT soldiers is only the beginning to truly understanding the complexity of Northern African American families over the period of time that I study. Now, in order to answer the fundamental questions guiding my research, I rely on a comprehensive collection of primary sources, which are listed here. Civil War pension records, military service records, regimental books, soldiers' published memoirs, city directories, federal census, public speeches by prominent individuals, the Union League's organizational records, and newspapers, particularly the Weekly Anglo-African that published out of New York City, and the Christian Recorder that was out of Philadelphia and connected to the African Methodist Episcopalian or AME Church. And I'm happy to talk about the sources, particularly newspapers. They are a gold mine to actually getting more deeper understanding of Black soldiering from the soldiers themselves. Now I'd like to turn to one of the many examples of these soldiers and their families so you can understand whom they were, how the war impacted them, and how it impacted their families long term. So in 1842, Andrew White, the son of Sarah and an unnamed man, was born in Philadelphia. Sarah, for undisclosed reasons, became a single mother raising 4 children, including Andrew, by herself until she married James Reeves on an undisclosed date. Excuse me. In total, the couple would raise 7 children, which created significant economic burdens on the family, as James was the only full-time wage earner working as a laborer due to racial discrimination, which was common not only in Philadelphia, but in many cases nationwide for many African American men in the hopes of supporting his family. Perhaps Sarah found part-time work to bolster the family economy in between raising the kids in their home. None of the school-age children attended school when they were school age. Their absences from school were not unique, as many other working poor African American Philadelphian families chose not to send their children to racially segregated schools that were inferior in nearly every way to their white counterparts, such as having unqualified teachers, continuously dealing with funding problems, and in some cases, not even having a roof or just dilapidated buildings that were absolutely horrendous. Other families needed their children to forego receiving a formal education and required the youths, sometimes as young as 5 years old, to find wage earning employment, even if only temporarily, to supplement their household income. It is entirely plausible that the Reeves children, including Andrew, had these experiences, which illustrated that race defined one's access to education and a social hierarchy that ignored an individual's age. For Andrew, reaching young adulthood forced him to assume more familiar responsibilities after his stepfather was no longer able to perform his duties as a laborer after incurring a ruptured hernia and rheumatism due to an exposure while working. Andrew was able to find work as a farm laborer, collecting $8 per month. The majority of his wages went to help his parents and siblings survive, as he was the sole full-time wage earner for his entire family. Andrew's familial obligations were well known among members of his local community. Jason Seaman and Henry Ellis, both childhood friends of Andrew's, later testified that Andrew was critical as a provider for his entire family, particularly after his father's afflictions materialized. As a bachelor, Andrew assumed the idealized male role as a breadwinner, even though his stepfather resided in the household. Perhaps this gave Andrew a conflicted understanding of gender ideology that many middle-class Americans, regardless of race, championed. Alternatively, maybe what mattered more to Andrew was keeping his family economically stable through his labor, which meant that material realities for this particular working poor family were starkly different from Victoria-era gender roles. Eventually, Andrew answered the United States mobilizing call to arms, and he enlisted on August 12th of 1863, joining the 6th USCI. And on the screen's right is the regimental flag, and the other is Camp William Penn, where the regiments were training. Now, records do not reveal what Andrew's motivations were for serving in the military. However, it is clear that his decision to fight created an immediate problem for his family, as he did not receive a $100 enlistment bounty, as the payment would occur after his service ended. The Reeves family was now without their breadwinner, and it meant that their finances became extremely chaotic as patriotism and militarized manhood trumped familial responsibilities. Now, serving in the United States Army did not cease Andrew from seeking to maintain a close relationship to his family back home. On March 25th of 1864, Andrew wrote Sarah and informed her of his time while near camp at Yorktown, Virginia. In the letter, he exclaimed his adoration for his family on the home front that he missed dearly. Andrew then complained about his financial woes, which made it harder for him to communicate with his family. Quote, "Dear mother, I hope you do not think hard of me for not writing you any sooner. I could not get paper to write you any sooner because paper is very hard to come by without any money." End quote. Perhaps his complaint about his inability to afford paper was due to the inefficiency of military paymasters who rarely paid out soldiers, regardless of race, in a timely fashion. He then beseeched Sarah to write him so that he could remain updated on how his family was doing in his absence. It is feasible that Andrew's request was his way of recognizing how military service jeopardized the finances of his parents and siblings. Now, for men like Andrew, armed combat was a defining component of military service, and without it, he was incomplete. Quote, "I have not been in a fight yet, but I have been in some very hard marches for a fight, but the rebel was afraid to stand up." End quote. Andrew's proud tone reveals that his and the regiment's manhood was on full display, while Confederate soldiers were, in his opinion, void of masculine patriotic honor due to their unwillingness to engage in armed combat. Maybe his family took pride in his confidence and bravery that he showed, but it also meant that their breadwinner pined to sacrifice his life. Now, full disclosure, this is actually a depiction of the battle at Olustee, Florida, but the image still holds true. Now, unfortunately, Andrew's wish came true as he received an injury on June 30th of 1864 at the Battle of Point of Rock in Virginia. He would later die from these injuries. And once the news came home, Sarah promptly applied for a mother's pension in the hopes of receiving some financial compensation for her son's death. Now, she only qualified for the pension because Andrew had died a bachelor. Otherwise, she would have been ineligible. None of Andrew's siblings were eligible since they were not his wife or children, nor did his father, for unknown reasons, apply for a pension. Now, Sarah did have her mother's application for a pension approved, and she also collected Andrew's $100 enlistment bounty. She began receiving a pension of $8 per month beginning in 1864, she would continue earning for the remainder of her life. In 1886, her pension increased to $12 per month. In 1896, it rose to $33 per month. Now, historian Larry Logue has argued that pensions were only meant to supplement an individual's income. Now, members of Sarah's local community, such as H. Powell, stated that throughout the late 19th century, Sarah frequently depended on the kindness of strangers to survive. Quote, "She is a widow of over 80 years of age and quite decrepit. She has been supported on the charitable people of her neighborhood." End quote. Additionally, Sarah resorted to selling candy and cakes to bolster her finances whenever possible. Now, since Sarah was the only documented individual in her household receiving money, it is feasible that this was rarely, if ever, enough to provide fiscal stability for the entire family. Now, becoming a pensioner did not stop federal government representatives from investigating in the private life of Sarah. Shortly after James died from pneumonia in 1886, pension agents, who were all white men, began an invasive examination of his employment and disability history to determine if Sarah should keep her pension or if she had been defrauding the federal government all along. Thomas Hoffman and Henry Gamble both testified that it was James's disabilities and not a dereliction of his supposed male responsibilities that kept him from working. Multiple childhood friends of Andrew confirmed that he was the sole full-time wage earner for the family, which confirmed Sarah's financial dependency on her son. Now, after the intrusive inquiry by the federal government's agents, Sarah's pension would continue, but it was only after questioning her validity and documenting her hardships to appease the skepticism of these pension agents. In the end, Andrew continued to help his family financially, even after death. But it is plausible that his family would have rather had him return home safely instead of receiving financial compensation. Now, in closing, the Civil War is usually framed as a national conflict to end slavery, restore American society, and reunify the United States. Historians have uncovered how important political figures, prominent civilian organizations, even USCT soldiers, and formerly enslaved people experienced the war. However, my research pushes the historiography with revamped and new methodologies that demonstrate it is plausible to drive our analysis to focus on underanalyzed African Americans who dealt with the long-term ramifications and its impact on civilians, in many cases 70 to 80 years after the war ended. Scholars have extensively documented the gendered and racial aspects of wartime experiences of USCT regiments to illustrate the significant role that African American men played in the Civil War. Recent scholarship provides more depth on the hardships of veterans and that they dealt with, while only briefly highlighting how families were the victims of the war's effects on their male kin. Ultimately, my research seeks to demonstrate that we should not only focus on these families that I study, but the hundreds of thousands of others who are also impacted by the war. Doing so illuminates the lives of many individuals whose stories and struggles matter, but remain silenced. And it is time to put the families at the center of historical examinations. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Holly. That was a wonderful talk. I look forward to having everybody's questions as they come in. As a reminder, anybody can ask questions in the Q&A at any time. We'll keep an eye out for those and read them out. We've got one question about whether there was evidence of Northern Black men being pressured to not enlist when they had a desire to. Was that anything you see emerging in these records that you look at from friends, from family, from community members? You know, what are the pressures there on these men not to leave home because they are, you know, the primary breadwinners sometimes?
Right. So, I mean, that is a great question and one that should be tackled a lot more. The quick answer is there is a very vocal contingent of Northern African Americans, particularly the Black press. So the two newspapers I mentioned in the first 2 years of the war are publishing constant editorials bashing, you know, even if a call comes, Black men don't go until they're going to give full equality and promise full citizenship, then go. If otherwise, don't do it. One of the interesting stories I love that I don't hear a lot of people mention is Frederick Douglass went to a number of Black churches doing these informal recruitment campaigns, and also Charles Redmond. And at one point, Douglass basically says, who will stand up and go with me and enlist? And nobody does. And it's actually a white member in the audience that just outright says, why should they? And it was just like that vocal criticism. There's also some family members. There's unfortunate stories of, particularly you see with young boys, you know, teenage boys that are desperate to prove their manhood, right? See the elephant, that term, if you will. There's a gentleman, his name is Lee Brown. He runs away from home at 13 and signs up as Solomon Wilson, and he'll actually die about 70 miles away from his family. And it's really heart-wrenching because the family reflecting on it in the pension is like, we told him not to go. He's gonna die, and he did. And I think that's really important. And just also, I would like to follow up with, the pressure is really important to recognize the prominence of Black women in wartime mobilization and support for the USCT. There needs to be a lot more focus on African American women's significance to the Civil War. And I say that because William D. Kelly, for example, the congressman from Pennsylvania, during a recruitment campaign will say to Black women, mothers, girlfriends, and that in their different ways, they're the most important recruiters to the war effort. And so it's like even politicians understood, soldiers in some cases understood that they were getting pressure either to or to not, depending on the circumstance, from African American women. And I believe that deserves a lot more credit than it, unfortunately, it has not gotten.
We have a question from a viewer interested in the GAR records, the Grand Army of the Republic, and this viewer has some expertise in the area. It says Philadelphia must have had both white, Black, and interracial GAR posts. They are themselves researching the 102nd USCT, and they have found the GAR records especially useful in piecing together the lives of veterans. So have you used them much yourself?
I have not, and that's only because the pension records didn't highlight the GAR as much as I had anticipated. One of the soldiers that I study outright says he went to a GAR meeting and found it a complete waste of time. And he was pretty blunt. I won't say everything he said, but it was kind of, well, I didn't expect that statement to come through. So and part of that is also I need to, disclosure on what the pension records do and don't reveal. There's usually not going to be discussions about GR activity. I would say maybe until the 1890s, once they're pushing through and getting federal legislation to expand the pension process. Having said that, my next book, which will be looking at all Pennsylvanian regiments and those Pennsylvanian families, will probably be able to get into that more, particularly looking at Camp William Penn to look at this military space to recognize Black empowerment.
To kind of continue on that theme about the pensions and the limitations and the things that they can reveal, we have a question about the ethical valence of doing such historical work, about using these materials and the forced exposure of personal details in a way that come out in these files. So, what are your thoughts on kind of balancing the ethics of dealing with these kind of, very intimate descent, or diving into these people's lives, and how you reckon with that when you're writing about it, which is something I do struggle with too.
I'll be honest, I struggle. When I was getting the records, I would call my mom after I'd start, I'd read and transcribe it, and some of them absolutely horrified me. They still horrify me, to be perfectly honest. I know, particularly for African American women, I know way too much about their intimate relationships with veterans, or men that they engage, or even the rumor of engagement with another man in terms of getting a pension. So unfortunately, for example, one of the widows, she'll have a child before she married the veteran. He dies. The unfortunate circumstance is when she applies for a pension, and the pension agent and the committee make her tell them about the first time that she met this gentleman, Frank Williams, and how it led to their child. And I know, unfortunately, way too much about that moment. And there's also a very invasive nature to the records, and that African Americans are having to prove themselves in order to get and appease white pension agents to get it. And that's a great point. And I'll be honest, I struggle with it a lot. I've tried to be very respectful in what I do and don't use in the book, because there are some things I kept because it wasn't my business to begin with, to be honest. I would only highlight maybe a few to just show the problems with the pension records. Having said that, in my book, I'm trying to also give agent, and others are doing this as well. One of the books behind me, I'm just going to give a free plug. Brandy Bremer's excellent book. She is one of the scholars that's also pushing this about we need to give agency to African Americans through the pension process. And what I mean by that is she talks about that they made these pension networks to help each other to try to navigate the system. And I'm also saying that even in the circumstances where people are disclosing many aspects of their lives that really isn't our business, that their continuance and persistence to be recognized and to have their sacrifices documented is amazing, and is in many ways, I'm making this one point about we can look at the pension records, even in a rejection, as refuting the lost cause, or as Adam Dombey, the false cause narrative, because the federal government is listening to the stories. I'm going to totally ruin the end of my book, but it actually ends with a daughter writing to Eleanor Roosevelt when she's the first lady. Her mother has cancer. She's on her last legs, unfortunately. Father's dead. She says, I'm a poor Black woman from Philadelphia. My family has nothing. You've done so much for our people. Can you help us? Eleanor responds in 7 days. I can't get my colleagues to answer in 2 weeks in an email, right? And Eleanor says, she basically sends it to the VA and says, I want an answer. And she gets one. And then this woman and Eleanor Roosevelt are in a dialogue. They develop a friendship. And to me, it's like I saw agency in that she is having a conversation with the first lady, and that it's this rapport, even though it leads to a rejection. We know her story. We know the tragic aspects of it, but she forced people to hear her, that she is a living monument to the war. So it's treading that delicate balance of how to navigate the records, particularly as it relates to even medical, aspects, because there's a lot of that in the pension records. Sorry if my answers are super long-winded.
Thank you.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I want to just ask a follow-up question
Yes.
on the point about, the need to be respectful of the memories of the people you're studying. Have you had much contact with descendants who are still alive today? And how does that feed into the whole research process?
So that is my dream. I mean, I'm getting chills as you asked that question. As I started this project, it's like these people became my families. That's like I've invested 10 years of my life in many cases to trying to tell their story and to hopefully do it respectfully, right? And to when I wrote it, I wrote it in such a fashion that hopefully post-COVID, I can go to the local communities of Philadelphia or the surrounding areas, do a presentation. And my hope of all hopes is that I do meet a descendant. Maybe they do agree or don't agree with the interpretation, but at least if we can agree that the argument of your family matters. And when people talk about the Civil War, they better recognize your struggles that your family went through. That I mean, to be honest, I will be very emotional. So that's my hope of all hopes. I haven't yet. And I will say in my second book, I'm going to try to do I will be honest, I privileged Philadelphia because it's so rich in its history. But the thing I'm noticing for the second project is we need to talk, and Hillary Green does a great job of this. Ed Ayers has done it as well. So I don't want to say I'm the first, but recognizing border towns, counties, communities, rural areas, and how they experienced the war. Because in many cases, those are the people that make up the majority, at least in some of the regiments I'm looking at for that new project. So I want to empower them as well to say, we need to not just talk about Philly or Harrisburg or even the bigger cities. We need to talk about what's happening in these counties far out, because they're the ones who have this very difficult journey to even get to the camp to enlist, if they even get in. So they're in a battle just to enlist.
Right, absolutely. We have somebody who's actually trying to research their four-time great-grandfather in North Carolina, who's running into some issues with trying to find a pension. So we can probably try and put you all in touch later.
Yes, it's difficult. I will add this. The one thing that I tried to do, and it might help for this person that's also navigating the federal census. I'm actually writing a piece for Muster on this right now. It can be super dry, but what I've actually found is a lot more about their living situations. And that's where I started to see whom these people were, particularly as children. Because one thing I discovered is some of the soldiers as kids were firemen. One guy was a miner and an engineer, and like they had really good jobs. So they actually lost money becoming a soldier. Some went to school, some were carpenters. A number of them lived with white families in a city that has one of the worst cases of racial violence in the 19th century. So it's like the federal census is a gold mine when you can contextualize it with the pension records, because the pension records don't always tell the whole story, but it's the best way to sometimes hear it from the people themselves. Having said that, the census has a lot of problems too.
Absolutely.
A couple of quick questions that I'm going to bundle together here. One is, you mentioned the Christian Recorder as one of the newspapers, and there was another one you mentioned. Can you remind us of the title of that?
Yes.
And then the other question, another quick one, is are there other books you would recommend to learn more? And of course, you've already recommended one, and we'll all recommend your forthcoming book, but are there any others that you would recommend?
Yes. So first, for the newspapers, so I want to be clear, I don't get any like royalties for mentioning like where these are from, but it'll help. So the Weekly Anglo-African is out of New York City, and there are some other newspapers that precede it, but that one was very vocal, and I believe it actually one of the first publications made it clear that we are about the Black community, and particularly one about our soldiers. And the Weekly Anglo-African at the end of the war has this very clear statement of which they're saying Black veterans need jobs. We need to open every door of employment to them. So it's like they're advocating in many cases for them. And I would assume through interlibrary loan, including the public library, you should be able to get microfilm on that. The Christian Recorder is published with the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopalian Church, and I believe through archivesaccessible.com or org. There's a way to get those. The thing that's amazing about both of those records, soldiers write in their editorials in there. Some are saying, we want to come home. And I have a new essay which kind of gets into that. We need to recognize that a number of Northern USCT soldiers want to leave. They're done, particularly after Lee has surrendered. They don't want to be the occupying force in the South. They don't want to be in Mexico, or sorry, the Texas border under the suspicion of this Mexican Napoleon III coming through there and starting this. They're tired. They're also dealing with lack of pay. As I was talking with Dr. Newhall's class, there's a lot of conversations about soldiers like, it's been 7 to 9 months. We have no money. I have families that are starving. I'm done. So it's like you hear it from the soldiers themselves. It's very passionate. Newspapers are amazing. The second question about other books, let's see. Oh, so many. Amy Morrell Taylor's Embattled Freedom is amazing. That's really helped me to resituate conversations with the family. Hillary Green is everything she writes. I'll just be honest. You can't go wrong with her. I'll also add that for me, reading the scholarship of even David Silkenet and Diane Miller Somerville to understand issues with suicide, because there's cases of self-harm on Black recruits. And I'm trying to connect that to what's happening for freed people and also Confederates. So there's a lot more of that. Margaret Humphreys, I think it's called Intensely Human, is a great book. Let's see, God, I could go for days trying to think of some really good ones. Oh, Norley Frankel, Freedom's Women. That's a classic. That's a go-to for me. I'd also add anything Chandra Manning writes, particularly Troubled Refuge. And I say that because she helps me to understand, and others to understand cultural citizenship. So the very brief way I'd explain it is, I used to think of citizenship in terms of right to vote, maybe even freedom of movement, whereas she's talking about it, and others, like Elizabeth Vergos and I think Caitlin Verbone, sorry if I mispronounced her name, and that this desire to belong to the nation, right? So if we use this idea of cultural citizenship, it provides a way to include women, children, not just men, that women are also demonstrating cultural citizenship. Judy Ginsburg's Army at Home, for example, gets into that. I don't know if you can see some of the books behind me, but any of these are going to be great. I love reading. So if anyone wants to follow up, I have questions, or I can give more suggestions.
Wonderful. Thanks.
Yeah, we definitely have some questions, further questions about the women who are involved in all of these processes.
Yes, let's go there.
Yes. And so one thing that was asked is, are there any instances of wives, of mothers who are trying to volunteer as nurses who are maybe barred from participating because of their race? And if they were not, if they're able to be present, does that affect the home unit back home? If both parents in fact are present in the camp, is that going to affect things back home?
So there's the historian answer is always yeah, but no, but sort of, kind of. So yes, I'll say this, and I've tried to do this in terms of in this book, and I will even drill it home more in the new one of when we think of particularly military camps for USCT regiments. Families are there. They're there. And in the Northern case, if not even just this, my dissertation also looked at New York's Black regiments, and Black women in New York were the ones that went there and helped to get the soldiers adequate housing, adequate food, and medical care, because they're saying that the Union League Club wasn't doing enough, and the federal government has basically left these men to sleep in dirt. How do you expect them to train properly? So Black women were there in New York, and they're also there in Pennsylvania, particularly Philadelphia. Some of them, if they can't become nurses or laundresses, some of the women, the mothers especially, what I've seen them do is they'll take up occupations super close to the camp so they can have close proximity. So there is some of that dynamic. Other Black women will just go constantly. There's one family that really, I trace them throughout the book, and it's the Davises. And so it opens up, God, I'm totally spoiling my book. It opens up in 1884. She's giving testimony because there's questions about, is her son legitimate? They're Jerome. And she says in 1884, I believe, to the pension agent, the United States Army stole everything from my family. We have nothing. Right. And it's just like, that was such a powerful statement. That reframed everything for me. But during the war, when her husband, Benjamin, tried to enlist in the 54th, he got a staph infection and missed the birth of their only son. So then the 6th finally does its mobilization. Benjamin enlists, but Mary Leighton's her name. She takes their newborn child and makes Benjamin swear that this is their child at camp. Multiple times. And even in the testimony of other soldiers, they were like, yeah, I remember that. That was super weird. And then there were also rumors about that she was not a good mother. She wasn't going to properly raise a child. So she actually gave up guardianship to Jerome's grandparents. But I'm arguing it's because she was so defiant in making sure that their child is recognized as being legitimate. That's the reason they get a pension, right? The son gets a pension. So it's like, even just the visibility of Black women, the agency that they're continuously showing, even when commanding officers like Louis Wagner are referring to some Black women as prostitutes or sex workers, but that same kind of categorization is not being given to the wives of officers. So there is a racialization. I'll also say that Black civilians get married at Camp William Penn. That's amazing, right? So I know Thabalia Glimph and Tara Hunter, I believe, I've talked about like marrying under the flag. And obviously that's happening in some cases in the South. It's happening in Camp William Penn, and it's recorded in the Black newspapers, which to me is really fascinating. So even, again, military spaces are ways for families to reconnect, to form, and to be dissolved. But they are, in many cases, everything to the Black community, as the Black family is trying to become part of the national family, as I steal a line from Hillary Green.
I'm really interested in Camp William Penn. Whereabouts was it? And is there anything to see if you go there today?
So Jonathan W. White, as he would know a lot more than me. He's he's a great scholar on Philadelphia. I've looked. There's like a one marker in the front gates, I believe, to Camp William Penn. And from what I remember from Margaret Beacon's book, the Camp William Penn was actually Lucretia Mott's family's plot that she donated to the United States military, which is awesome because she would actually, from time to time, visit the space and bring them good, like baked goods, and just check in on the soldiers. So again, women of many races are visible at military camps for different reasons. It's my hope that Camp William Penn is put into this important conversation because 11 regiments in total will train there and muster there. So it's very visible in Pennsylvania life. The one thing I didn't do for the first book, which I should for the new one, is also talking about military processions in the camp, but also outside. There needs to be a little bit more conversation about that. I know Alessandra Larini has done so, but those were spaces in which the Black community reshapes race and gender very visibly, and particularly Black women. They are there, they are cheering, they are saying, you, society, need to recognize what we give to this country in the same way that white people do, particularly white women. We're ladies, we're women. We need to be respected for what we've always done for our community and families, but what we are now showing again repeatedly to this country. So there's so much depth that can be done on Philadelphia's, or Pennsylvania, but particularly Philadelphia, in terms of the Civil War and looking at race and gender.
Yeah. I've got a couple of questions I'm going to maybe smush together, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So one question is about whether there were other ways for these men to define their manhood outside of the war. Was that possible? What were some of the avenues in which they were able to do that? And then another viewer mentions and wants to know if you're familiar with Martin Murray White of Philadelphia, who was a USCT officer and thrown off of the officer's car in a train in Pennsylvania because he was Black and told to go to the colored car. And he sued the railroad, claiming entitlement. Case went to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. He lost. The court allowed the railroad to continue to segregate and disallow Black officers. The same privileges allowed other officers. So, are those at all connected?
Yes, without question. And obviously, I believe Philip Foner and again, Judy Giesberg has talked about this. Like, the moving theaters, if you will. And I know also Kate Masser and a few others have highlighted as well. The moving theaters of streetcars, rail cars, public transit at the time also brought their own battles. And it's really important to recognize, as many others do, is that, you know, these private close spaces, which sometimes could be intimate, unfortunately often put people of color into violent situations, because in not only Philadelphia, New York City, but even in Boston, which I believe had the first, you know, racially segregated streetcar or Jim Crow car, that it was basically at the privilege, if you will, or of white conductors and even white people around to violently remove or assault African Americans or Black people in general who are not sitting in their appropriate spaces. I've read stories of women who are pregnant being thrown from the streetcars, elderly people who are froze to death on the exposed, what they called Negro car, which was just in a platform. I mean, the stories are horrific. And there were definitely cases of Black soldiers and even white officers or allies wearing uniforms as, again, sit-ins, right? Basically as civil rights demonstrations connecting to wearing their uniform to challenge racial discrimination. And that's important. And others have already talked about that. And I love that that's where the conversation is going, right? That using that term of there's a modern civil rights movement, and civil rights activism has a long history for many different people. To the question about the manhood question, yes. African-American manhood, African-American womanhood is defined every day, every second for these people in their homes and in their communities. I argue they don't need military service to define Black manhood or womanhood, but they will use it, and they will do so visibly, violently in some cases. But I don't, you know, I guess I have some disagreement with the notion when, you know, Frederick Douglass says, this is how you prove you're a man, you know, in this battle. And it's like, to me, that devalues every second that these people have fought before that moment and after. That by saying that kind of rhetoric, you're ignoring the fact that those children saw their father as a man, or that those men saw themselves as men because of the way they keep their families together, or the critical role that every person played in that family to keep it afloat, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. The war provides a new avenue, but it also complicates manhood. You know, there's a recent book that talked about Black men became men through their deaths in the Civil War. And, you know, my book, I'm like, what does that mean? It means nothing when I'm dead. Like, it doesn't, and families of soldiers and veterans will say the same thing. This means nothing. Some of them say, I want my family back. So, you know, talking about even monuments and all that, and this proud chivalric or militarized manhood, it's really complicated. And also to that point of, you know, the notion of manhood, it gets really messy when we add in the prominent role that African-American soldiers, many USCT veterans who become Buffalo soldiers, will play as, you know, in unfortunate violence against Native American populations. And you know, that's a conversation when I talk with my students, they're always like, wait, what? I'm like, yes, to be a Black man in the eyes of the federal government and white society, and to be a, you know, a citizen meant that you have to do violence to another group of racial minorities who are still suffering from those hardships.
So one of the great things I think about your project and your forthcoming book is the way you look at the kind of shadows or legacies of Civil War military service over a long period of time. And one viewer is wondering whether future generations in these families signed up for military service, you know, maybe inspired by the Civil War generation. And then I would even kind of broaden that out beyond individual families and think about how memories of Civil War military service affected the debate during World War I and World War II, you know, when African Americans faced some of the same kinds of decisions, you know, we're being asked to go and fight. Is this going to mean equality or true citizenship? Right. They're kind of sending positive signals, but is it really going to happen? So were people thinking about the Civil War precedent when they made those decisions?
So the one case I've seen, at least for this project, there was oh God. See, the problem is there's so many names that run through my head, so I'm trying to remember like off the top of my head. I want to say it was Francis Fawcett. he had, I believe it was him, he had a son, or he had a relative who did serve as a soldier later. And there was just like this pride in how he taught that it was mentioned even in the pension record, because that wasn't pertaining to the case at all, but was still worth noting. It is very possible that some of their future generations, even if it's not their children, maybe it's distant relatives or extended kin that would have served. So there is that. Without question, that one thing I'm trying to situate my work in is that this is a military history. This is a politics of a racialized politics of memory. This is so many ways, and we need to understand that this is a long-standing fight for inclusion in American society. And through the pensions, through the constant, the persistence of these families to not be forgotten, to me, that is the most powerful story, because it is easy to look at this project as a doom and gloom, right? And that it's so different, and it is, and it's absolutely heart-wrenching. Some of the stories are just painful. And what I mean by that is those who would deal with what we know as PTSD. There's a number of soldiers who have domestic violence issues that comes out. One of them is Wilson Day. In the post-war, he will try to burn his children's ears off at the stove, and his neighbors will note that it wasn't uncommon to hear violent screams, usually as he's trying to kill his wife. So like literally there was a neighborhood watch to stop him from attempting to choke his wife to death. And it's horrific. It's absolutely horrific. He ends up actually dying in the Blockley Almhouse. And that story is even tragic because he'll die in an attic, because they would put USCT veterans or African Americans and also white immigrants into these horrific conditions. And in the hospital records, it says it is not uncommon for there to be a murder amongst the patients once a day. If not, the staff is surprised. And I think of that, and at this context of Civil War memory and people talking about honoring the legacy, nobody cares that he's eating rats in an attic. Nobody cares what his family experienced when he is violently assaulting them. Like their stories matter, right? He is a living monument. His family is a living monument. Their memories matter. And I'm trying to complicate the conversation, particularly by adding in what does all this mean for family? And I say this because I'm the child of someone who served. So my mother was, she served for 25 years, was deployed internationally. And I struggle to understand her service as a child. So this project for me actually helps me to appreciate more deeply what my mother served and many people like her, because I hope that this story and its methods goes beyond just African Americans. It's about recentering on what it means for families. When someone says, thank you for your service, do they understand that that's not just a statement for the soldier or the veteran? It's a conversation for that family who pined and lived in fear, constantly waiting for them to come home, dealing with various forms of issues, whether it's mental illness, unemployment, depression, that it's not just the veteran, it's their community. And that's my hope with this project, is that this pushes a conversation about refocusing on what is all this memory, this, the monuments, if you will, for people, because it's the people that matter, not the war. And maybe that's controversial to say that, but I said it.
Yeah, that's a wonderful statement. I think that totally rings true. And based on that, are there, out of the many, many stories you've had to look through, out of all of the research that you've conducted, are there any particular people or stories that have really stuck with you that, just kind of really inspired you as you've been doing this research and kind of want to bring forth as much as possible?
I'll say they all inspire me in different ways. For me, it's and I'll say this, the one thing that is phenomenal about the pension records, and I think back to when I was a graduate student, right? People would say, we can't find African-American sources. Where are they? And my advisor, Leslie Schwalm, was like, here they are. They're in the pensions, and they're there in detail. And Black women's voices are very, very visible. One of them, Kate Ellsbury, I believe, she'll write the Pension Bureau over 7 months repeatedly, my father died and I paid for all of it. I want to be compensated. I want my money. And she will not be forgotten. And guess what? The Pension Bureau pays her. So it was like her case to me was that persistence was amazing, right? And that she's saying, you won't forget what we gave. So you're going to give us not just money, but you're going to remember this and document it. There's also just really fascinating anecdotes, like one of the soldiers becomes he's a barber before the war. He remains so after. It's actually Francis Fawcett. He will travel the country. He makes his way to Arkansas, Montana, California, and he wears his uniform and is known as the veteran like barber. So he actually uses his like soldiering experience as ways to get sort of like business. And I think like it's actually really awesome. And there's like people that talk about him across the country, like he would always talk about his service. So it's like he won't let people forget even while you're paying to get a haircut, which is to me really cool. There's also unfortunate stories of there's like a whodunit that I stumbled into while doing the project. One of the veterans is a whaler, and he will be shipping out in the Atlantic Ocean. The ship comes back, he doesn't return. Leads to this years-long investigation in which the Pension Bureau is trying to figure out what happened to him. And the captain doesn't help the situation because he said, I didn't like him anyway, so good luck finding him. Right. And it's this just like really fascinating story, which doesn't get closure and they don't find him. But it's just like you get the letters that he's writing home about, I'm not being paid. My captain is horrible. I should just quit. This is the last time I'm doing this trek. I love you. I miss you. Right? And it's just like, so it's like their stories, even the heart-wrenching ones, are amazing to me because I'm getting to understand who they were. Because I think to me, that's the most important. They're people. They have joys, successes, fears, aspirations that matter. Yes, without question, the 14th, 15th Amendment, all these bills matter, all these moments matter, but we also need to understand what does it mean on the ground level? And not always looking at the major prominent historical figures. They're always going to be there, but what does it mean for those who served and gave everything? And I don't want to say they got nothing because they got a lot. And what I'll say they got is that they're remembered. And through the pension records, hopefully through this project and many others who, have and hopefully will do the work because the pension records are phenomenal sources.
This is fascinating stuff. I'm going to be kind of selfish here and ask the last question myself. Yes. We've had some wonderful questions from the audience that we really appreciate. I've been wondering about the movie Glory, partly because I'm teaching a course on slavery and the Civil War in film this semester, and so we've talked about Glory. How I assume you've seen it, and if so, what do you think of its representation of the subject? What's missing? What does it do well?
All right. Yeah. First of all, I mean, I've seen Glory way too many times. I can quote it nearly word for word. Like it's kind of sad to say it, but it's true. I love Glory. Like I will cry. There's 3 scenes that will make me cry. The dress parade, and this actually gets to your point, when they're marching through Boston, Massachusetts in uniform, and you see the crowd, not just the people of prominence, the local community cheering them on. That is on point. And I think it's, we need to have more conversations about the military processions and what it means for the community in particular. I think you get a lot of the Black masculinity, like there's a lot of Black manhood rhetoric in there, and obviously the brunts that they experience when going up against whites, particularly I think of the sergeant and the racism that he's showing them in his training, but even to the officers and the negative ways they're looking at African Americans. The campfire scene is, to me, that's probably the hardest to watch, knowing that they're coming to grips with their mortality, right? Like, sorry if you haven't seen the movie, y'all, totally spoiling it. But like that scene, they're basically like, we know we're gonna die. The thing that I gravitate to with that movie well, there's a couple of things. First of all, I recently watched it, and I think if I remember right, at the beginning, it uses the verbiage of the war between the states, which I'm like, wait a minute, that's definitely not what they would have called it, right? Like so there's that lingo, which needs to be discussed more. Also, Black women are not given enough prominence in their role, particularly as they're training. Like I think I saw one scene where they're in the background, but they don't say, they're not there. And I think about when Denzel and they're talking about tear up the pay, because I thought of the families, and particularly also Morgan Freeman's statement when he says, "I left my kinfolk in Bundy." I always think of that line because I'm like, what does this mean to their children, to their fictive kin, to their community? And I really struggle with that. Having said that, I will always show glory in a class, but I will always critique it. I believe that there is a new film coming out with Will Smith that's called Emancipation, which is going to look at a freed man who joins a USCT regiment. So I'm hoping against, that this is like going to really re-push the conversation. And it's my hope that, I can get someone to take my project and write a screenplay for it. I would love to see it. Like I can see the people in my head as I wrote and read it. So my dream of all dreams is to have this on film or some, streaming app, whatever, because, there needs to be more visibility on the Black experience in the Civil War. We have a lot of Civil War stuff, but the Black experience is pretty minimized still.
Well, I think if that happens, you've got a lot of viewers in the audience tonight. Certainly, I'll be first in line to watch it and would really appreciate that opportunity. And I really want to thank you. I think, our speaker series is called, New Perspectives on the Civil War Era. And you've provided, I'd say, dozens of new perspectives just in your talk alone. It's just been fascinating. And especially that kind of central idea that the Civil War was not just over in 4 years. It wasn't confined to what happened on the battlefield. It's once you move beyond the battlefield and after 1865 and look at the families of the men involved, that you really get a sense of how broad and lasting the ramifications were. So that's just a great lesson for us all. And I also want to thank the members of the audience. You gave us wonderful questions. I've so enjoyed our discussion tonight. It's been fantastic. I also want to thank donors to the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies. They make everything we do possible. So I really don't want to miss the opportunity to thank them. I want to thank Dr. Newhall as well. Of course, I think we've made a great team this year with our speaker series and the moderation of the Q&A. And of course, those of you who were here at the first lecture will know that it was Dr. Newhall who delivered it, and her lecture is available on the YouTube channel and C-SPAN as well. So thank you very much. And most of all, thank you for a wonderful lecture to Dr. Pinheiro. It's been fantastic to learn about your book. I'm looking forward to it coming out next year. So thank you.
Thank you all so much.